Welcome back to Writers Read. And I like that phrase, welcome back. It means we have been together before. And here we are again. I like that whole sequence of events. Today we have two returning readers, Cassandra Carothers and Audrey Weitkamp. So before you know the routine, before we can hear them read, we say Paul's poem. Here we go. Right, right, right.
Right, right, right.
Until you get it right.
Until you get it right.
Then read aloud.
Then read aloud.
You'll draw a crowd.
You'll draw a crowd.
And bring us great delight.
And bring us great delight.
Okay, Cassandra, it's so good to see you, and I'm so looking forward to your
Nancy.
lovely voice and your lovely writing.
Thank you.
Welcome, welcome.
Welcome.
And we are interested in having you read now.
Well, you know, I thought I'd start off with just a little 30-second read. And because it delights me. You may recognize someone in it that's here. I entitled it Disparate Thoughts. And this was written in April of 21. Several weeks ago, I made a connection between making clothes for my children so many years ago and now mending toys for Chloe. The likeness they share seems so apparent. They were both made with love. The former because of the pattern and the material I selected to make it special for them. The latter, also repaired with love, extends the life of a favorite toy. It's what we do for one another when we love someone. We want to do things for them that please them and ourselves in the balance. Such small everyday things, yet I suspect the result is what maintains our equilibrium in the world. This is a juicier, longer story, and it was on April 30th, 2020, 2 months into Horizon House's COVID protocol, and I began writing this piece. It was a late afternoon, a day before the anniversary of George's and my commitment ceremony 4 years ago. I was experiencing an unfolding of melancholy. It came from an acknowledgement of sadness, a sadness wrought because of what I had once experienced in real time is now only in memory. While fixing dinner for myself, I began to envision a scenario that could lighten up my mood. It occurred to me that it might be fun to have both Richard and George join me for dinner. That idea alone is brought about principally because I have become increasingly comfortable talking out loud with both of them at the same time. Not all the time, but it certainly makes it easier. Kind of a lingual shorthand of sorts. Yet even still, sometimes I prefer to talk with each of them privately. I think it's important for you to first understand a fundamental truth before I continue. I have never considered Richard and George as competitors for my attention. Each of them received all the love I had to give during this special time when we were together. I hit the jackpot. They were so easy to love, and we were each perfect for one another at that special moment in our lives. 35 years with Richard and 4.5 with George. I can still feel their love and what it felt like, even now. Each of them gave me exactly what I wanted and needed all that magical moment in time. I have never compared them because the circumstances and timing of our separate loves were independent of one another. There was space in between. Different times in our lives and different wants and needs. I blossomed with their attention and love, as did they with mine. So let us continue with the dinner conversation about to take place. This is how I imagine it. I set my round, small dining table for 3 of us. Richard was seated on my left, George seated across from me, facing me, and then I introduced them formally, just in case they had not met up with one another before this occasion. However, that was highly unlikely, because I have credited Richard all along for sending George to me in the first place. Yes, Richard reached for just and searched for just the right person for me to love in his absence. It was a masterful selection. I invited them to each tell a story that would give some notion or flavor of what our relationship was like. Richard was game, and it did not surprise me when he volunteered first. This trial balloon was off to a good start. It felt like the right light-hearted approach for these 2 guys to learn about one another's relationship with me. Perhaps there would be similarities that seemed familiar, or perhaps not. This exercise did not have a goal other than simply sharing special times together that reflected who we were as a couple. I was optimistic. I hoped it would be fun, entertaining, and perhaps informative in unexpected ways. I wasn't disappointed. We were in for some good storytelling. Richard was ready and began his first tale that occurred shortly after we were married. However, a little background prior to the marriage will be helpful. Our dating period was wild and wonderful. We met in the summertime of 1977. We were technically engaged on Halloween and married February 18th, 1978. We were flying high. Richard vaguely mentioned he wasn't paying much attention to his business when we were dating. He said he could only concentrate on the next time we would be together. We honeymooned in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. Surely 10 days of bliss. We could not have been more fortunate where we stayed. Individual casas built into the side of a steep incline, navigated by a vehicular going up and down from one casa to another. Each private patio overlooked the one below. All the while we had an unobstructed view of Puerto Vallarta Bay. The common pool was right outside our doorstep. Everything about our trip was perfect. That became the beginning of an annual getaway multiple times, each time reserving the same complex and apartment, one memory atop another. While we were gone, my mother, who had come out for our marriage ceremony, also came so she could babysit 5 of our 7 combined teenagers. Wasn't she the brave one? Well, she loved it, as she could dish it out as well as take it. However, unseen under the covers, I suspect the mob of 5 were developing their own strategies for complete bedlam awaiting our return. I think the best way to describe our homecoming is to say it was somehow peculiar. The atmosphere was difficult to gauge. The kids were there to greet us, but as we shared later, we each experienced our individual radar on full alert. Mother was also pleased to see us, and I think her presence helped the transition of our return. Yet something was off-kilter, like something underneath was smoldering. When Mother left a day or 2 later, it was a whole new ballgame. The brood of 2 mixed families was not a happy scene. Forget the Brady bunch. My kids, 3 of 4, Lori was already gone, resented having to share space with the newcomers. The newcomers, 2, hated having to move from their homes, schools, and friends. Who could possibly blame them? They didn't seem to like each other much either, just comrades in a communal war. In the same time frame, I remember awakening one early morning, and as we turned towards one another, we were both crying. The situation was miserable. I have never been a sailor, but this had to be what a mutiny feels like. So wedded bliss turned into a cesspool. I can't remember ever experiencing a more conspiratorial scene than this one, before or since. Richard and I felt helpless and inept to the situation. So in our ignorance, we tried to battle it with force. Not a good idea. With this information as a backdrop, Richard went back to his business, as did I. A certain routine began to emerge, and it was on Saturday morning when I was cleaning the house while Richard was at the office that the phone rang. When I answered it, the caller said, "I'm calling about the silver Jaguar." My ears pricked up on alert. I didn't encourage his inquiry. Again, he said, "The silver Jaguar you have advertised in the newspaper?" I said he must have the wrong number. When Richard arrived home, I was waiting for him. I asked if he could tell me anything about a Jaguar for sale. Incidentally, Richard was driving a silver Jaguar when we were courting and had just parked it in our garage before entering moments earlier. He looked like a deer in the headlights. This is where Richard enters to explain his perspective of the situation. He revealed that during our courtship, he sort of let all the marketing in his office slide because he had a more important focus, which was namely me. His in-house bookkeeper brought to his attention that the payroll was due the following week for a staff of maybe 12 to 15 people at the time, and was he aware that the business account had only $300 some in the bank? Hence the advertisement and call regarding the Jaguar. He was so embarrassed. Incidentally, this information luckily came after I learned, yet prior to our marriage, that as a sole proprietor of all of Richard's business obligations were also mine. Yikes. This was not what I wanted to hear. That he would decide to sell his car without consulting me was not okay. We were partners now, and bilateral decisions were the new norm. I did not want to learn from a stranger that he had decided to sell his car. I was angry, stormed out of the house, and went down to Pandy Cameron and bought 2 new Oriental rugs. I don't even recall what he did following, but I do know he didn't sell the car, and within a month, maybe 2, Richard again was back in his groove as rainmaker for his firm. The lesson learned in this chapter, most importantly to me, was Richard realized that our relationship was different from his former marriage, where he made all the financial decisions. I had a full-time career when we met and used to managing the money, and with 3 or 4 children living at home. The new protocol is what we would share in all household, family, and even business-related decisions, now that I understood my exposure being married to Richard. Oh, and by the way, I still have the 2 rugs from Pandy Cameron. Now, I turned to George. He had a smile on his face. George often had a smile on his face, but this was a knowing smile. Did he recognize something as familiar? Taking his cue from Richard, George decided he would like to tell his version and circumstances of first meeting Cassandra, and for the reader to determine if there might be a glimpse of similarities. A little background would be useful to introduce the circumstances of our first meeting in late December 2014. Richard had died 1.5 years earlier. I had been attending a monthly transition group here at Horizon House since Richard's death. I also went there before he died because I was losing little parts of him along the way. That particular day, I had been in a yoga class and came into the group meeting after it had already started. The truth is, I hadn't been going regularly because with the writing I was doing after Richard was gone, I felt I was doing okay. But this was the last time Kizzy, our spiritual director, was going to be there before her retirement, the end of the year, and I wanted to say my goodbyes properly. The transitions meeting that day was held in the chapel in this very room. I was aware of a new person sitting in the circle. I walked past him as I headed for the remaining empty chair. When I sat, and where I sat, provided me a profile view of this person. As I observed him, he was quiet, soft-spoken, nice-looking with a relatively full head of white hair. He got my attention. Because it was Christmas week, there were a lot of distractions. For instance, some of the residents living at Horizon House had made children's toys in the woodworking shop as gifts to needy families. Consequently, we were raving about the talent and love put into this effort. But amidst the activity, I remember this new person tell the date his wife died. We did not connect at that time. However, as I left the room, I walked by him and stooped sufficiently to pat him on the knee and say, "We have something in common. Our spouses died the same week." I didn't stop to introduce myself, but kept on going. The next time I saw him was across the room at the New Year's Eve party. I was with a group of residents Grant Hildebrand had invited to sit at his table. From a distance, I saw this same person walking towards something, and I had this immediate impression. That man is smiling, but he is dying inside. Shortly afterwards, by total chance, I ran into Mary Beth McCauley. I correctly guessed she hosted this same person at her table on New Year's Eve. I asked her, what was the name of that new guy with her group on New Year's Eve? "You mean George?" "Yes," was my response. She didn't miss a beat and intuitively asked, "Would you like me to set up a lunch?" "Yes," I said, and she did. A week later, she, Hugh, George, and I were a foursome for lunch. That's enough background. Now it's time for George to reminisce and share what he would like to say. George began by expressing to Richard how much he enjoyed the story he had just shared with us. That was a consistent calling card of George to acknowledge someone first before he would begin. So I was getting comfortable and leaned back in my chair to hear his version of the storyline he chose to recall. As he told his story, he explained we all arrived individually for lunch that Mary Beth set up for the four of us. She reserved a foretop with a window on one side. She and Hugh took the outside seating across from one another, and George and I sat across from one another as well, next to the window. It all seemed so effortless. Lots of laughter from the beginning. He also remarked on how he got himself into a tight squeeze when he asked about Mary Beth and Hugh's relationship. He assumed they lived together and said something to that effect. Mary Beth was quick to correct him. Hugh was more recently widowed, and Mary Beth didn't want him to be uncomfortable by George's question. So she managed to explain their situation quite candidly, and George knew he had overstepped. But it was all explained in such a very friendly manner, and the good vibes just kept rolling. The conversation flowed from one thing to another, nothing in particular, other than what George had just recalled above. But I do have a distinct recollection that George and I were quite attuned to our own conversation, like having a conversation within a conversation. Mary Beth and Hugh seemed tickled by what they observed. It was probably a 2-hour lunch. As George and Cassandra were leaving the dining room together, he mimicked something that Cassandra told him at the time. According to George, I said, "George, there is something I have to tell you. I set this up." He must have been proud of that because he told the story multiple times in mixed company, and we always laughed. But I would defend my statement because I did not want him to learn that piece of information from someone else. As the two of them approached the lobby area, there was a seating bench, and Cassandra suggested they stop there for a few minutes. She had an idea and proceeded to propose it to George. She said, "The next time we get together, why don't we share with one another some of the things we loved about our separate spouses?" He seemed responsive to the idea, but very shortly afterward, he called to say that he just wasn't ready for a relationship, and that reasoning, he ended the conversation. He learned later from Cassandra that she was disappointed, but not beaten. Several weeks later, he received a call from her, inviting him to share a meal together at her place. She had made a fresh pot of farro beef vegetable soup and asked if he would like to come. He did. Again, conversation was easy. She told him later that no one was more surprised as she, when as she walked him to the door, as he was leaving, he stopped and said, "Surely your meal deserves a hug." I guess so, because I got a very nice hug, but I didn't let it go to my head because he loved to hug many people. He was the one that initiated a call the next time they got together. He suggested lunch at Ivor's on Lake Union. This time, again, conversation just got easier and easier. It was a rainy day, and when they left the restaurant, it was raining fairly steadily. George opened the door for Cassandra and then got in and started the car, or tried to start the car. It seemed he left his lights on and the battery was kaput. He called AAA, and then we waited. In hindsight, it was a fortuitous occurrence. The patter of the rain on the rooftop made for a cozy interior. We laughed about the circumstances, and then that led to our talking about things of a more personal nature. It seemed we were both anxious to share at a deeper level. Once AAA arrived and did whatever they do to get a dead battery going, we drove towards Horizon House on Westlake along Lake Union. George told me, among other things, of his prostate cancer and how that can result in unintended outcomes. Further, he spoke openly how the human species learns to adapt to new realities and accommodates accordingly. He also shared he was soon going with 2 of his 3 children and their families to Sayurita, near Puerto Vallarta, for 12 days. With that news, I was missing him already. When he returned from Mexico, we were so ready to see each other. George began a ritual he practiced every morning following his floor exercises. He would call me at 8:45 to say, "Good morning, sweetheart," and then review what our schedule looked like for the day. It was such a dear, sweet way to begin our relationship that developed more fully every single day. So that was the beginning of our relationship that grew into a committed relationship that manifested itself in a commitment ceremony a year later. And what, if any, parallels did George observe between Richard and his own story? Well, he began, Cassandra likes disclosure. She did not want any stray but important issues to be left outstanding. She is not coy. She is comfortable being direct. It is a style George came to admire and respect, as did Richard. May 18th, 2020. Today would be George's birthday. He would be 92 years old. Recognizing that fact, the one that slipped my mind since saying happy birthday to him earlier in the day, has me teary-eyed. I've reread the poems on the refrigerator he wrote me, looked at his photograph that I love, and now listening to my favorite jazz pieces that he liked too, leaves me weak and lonesome for his touch, nuzzling my neck and putting his hands on my waist. I think that's what we called it. Neither of these two men were ordinary. I love their different styles and how they each experienced and contributed to life in their own distinctive ways. Still, they each shared equal importance in my life. Curiously, a week before George died, I asked him, as an agnostic, George, would he like me to talk with him aloud when he was gone? He stepped away and thought about my question. He was aware of how I talk out loud to Richard. He came back, put his hand on my shoulder and said, yes, I would. Did he say that just to please me? Or maybe he thought to himself, just in case? George liked to listen to me talking to myself when I was wearing Roger. That's the audio transmitter that I wore around my neck so that I could hear what he's saying and he could hear what I'm saying back. Often while getting dinner, he would slip into the bathroom, and when he returned to the kitchen, he would come back chortling about what he heard me say. Continuing in the likeness of what they both experienced with me, another story with Richard occurred well into our marriage. We were getting ready to go somewhere, and Richard and I were sharing the bathroom. He was taking a shower while I was doing my makeup. As he stepped out of the shower, drying himself, he looked at me, winked, and said, "You're number one, you know." And I shot back, "I'm a close number two, and we both know it." And we both broke out laughing, because each of us knew what I was referring to. His mistress. The mistress was his love of the firm he created, love of design, love of marketing, the chase it required, and his success in doing so. I was never jealous. I was simply proud of him in the ways he did what he loved. What they shared in common: they each loved to touch. They had very similar values, be honest and the golden rule. Their differences were more style than substance. For example, Richard would offer his opinion freely, while George was more considered before he spoke. George was a poet. He read poetry, he wrote poetry, he lived poetry. Whereas Richard was more apt to read Louis L'Amour. Richard was keenly visual with his architectural background and design of any sort had his rapt attention, while George was an acute listener, a word man, whose vocabulary alone was impressive. He also seemed to hear what wasn't spoken as well. The latter a talent, I've been told, we shared. What a lovely thought and ending.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much. This was just being with you and George and Richard right at the table.
This lady knows George.
Yeah.
George, yes.
So thank you so much,
Thank you,
Cassandra.
Carol.
That was just a gift to all of us.
Thank you.
Oh, great. Okay, and I think now, Carrie, about when he's ready. Hi, Audrey. Carrie gave us the signal that we're ready to go here. I want to take just a minute to remind our viewers about the book Writers Read, a 3-ring binder, which is on the shelf of our window in the library. And I want to read the names of the people who have their pieces from Writers Read in this notebook. Ina Bray, George Counts, Peggy Johnson, Paul Niebank, Lou Templeton, Audrey Weitkamp, Nancy Wiesner, Cassandra Carothers, Mary Piet, Gussie Howe, and Grace Popoff. And so this was spring and fall of 2021, and so now we're in kind of a new session, and we'll put some more pieces in this book. Before we started today, Audrey and I were talking about her writing just for a bit, for me to understand what she was sharing today, and she came up with 2 words that I really am going to use, and those 2 words are memory pieces. And I love that it doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. What she's going to share with us today are memory pieces. Those, thank you, Audrey, and welcome, and we're looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you.
Yes.
The first piece is one I wrote the day after it happened. So the memory was very recent when I wrote it. It was so unusual that I felt like I had to get it down right away. And it's called Aunt Ruth. Bill's Aunt Ruth and Uncle Norman welcomed us when we arrived in Seattle in the 1960s, and we had often celebrated holidays together. Now, many years later, when we talked to their son about inviting his folks for Thanksgiving dinner, he warned us that Aunt Ruth would drive us crazy, asking the same questions over and over. We already knew she was suffering from serious memory problems, but we wanted to include her and her husband anyway. Do you think we could get her to tell the grandkids about being a stewardess on the railroad? I asked Jim. In the 1930s, Aunt Ruth had been a stewardess on the Challenger train that ran between Omaha, Nebraska, and San Francisco, part of the Union Pacific Railroad. Probably, he replied. She remembers more about those days than what happened last week or even yesterday. I'll bring the railroad book that has a picture of her in her uniform, and that'll give her a prop. Thanksgiving is a happy holiday in our house. When our children were young, foreign students from the nearby university often joined us. Now that our children had children of their own, and most lived nearby, there were 4 generations gathered around our dining room table, and the ages ranged from 7 until 98. Ruth's husband was the oldest, and she was 96. She did drive our granddaughter, who sat next to her at the table, slightly crazy by asking over and over again, "Now, whose child are you?" After dinner, we all settled in the living room with our coffee and plates of pumpkin or pecan pie. Aunt Ruth had to be led to a chair and looked around the room with that slightly bewildered look she often had. "Ruth, could you tell the grandkids about your days as a stewardess?" I asked when the room had gotten quiet. The bewildered look disappeared, and she looked over at her husband with a shy smile. He nodded encouragingly, and she surprised us by standing up as if about to give a school report. She explained that she had been a Nebraska farm girl who'd left the farm and had already graduated from nurses training when she answered the advertisement. The Union Pacific was looking for graduate nurses to serve as stewardesses on the train from Omaha to Nebraska. From Omaha to San Francisco. What could be more glamorous? For 20 minutes, she told us about her duties, bringing newspapers, serving meals, pouring second cups of coffee, answering questions about the route, and providing pillows and blankets. She and her fellow stewardess, there were always two on each run, were especially helpful to mothers traveling with small children, heating bottles of formula, minding toddlers while the mother went to the restroom, offering to walk with a fussy baby. As Ruth talked, we passed around the train book, admiring her trim uniform, the high heels on her feet, the jaunty cap on her head. She was a slender brunette, pretty, and the epitome of sophistication. The grandkids had all kinds of questions. Where did you sleep on the train? In a special sleeping compartment, just for the other stewardess and me. We took turns being on call at night. But where did you sleep when you got to San Francisco? Asked one of the girls. The railroad provided us with our own little apartment to use on our layovers. The railroad took good care of us. My mother never had to worry. Did anything exciting ever happen? Asked one of the boys who didn't think heating baby bottles and bringing pillows sounded very interesting. Well, we did have one accident when the train derailed. She replied and told how it occurred and what she had done in the emergency. Finally, the questions were over. She had talked, entertaining us all for a half hour. As she stood there, her shoulders drooped, her chin sagged, and the slight hump between her shoulder blades became a little more pronounced. The bewildered look returned to her eyes. Someone jumped up and helped Ruth find her chair. I think you can see why I wanted to write that down immediately.
Yeah, you did it.
The second piece was written, I don't know, I probably wrote the first version maybe 10 years ago, something like that. It happened really about over 60 years ago. And I should explain that shingle in the story, and it's all true, means small rocks, stones. And the book is called Shingle Street, Suffolk, England. How much farther now? One of our kids asked from the back seat. Oh, you'll see it as soon as we get out of these trees. There it is, I exclaimed. That's Shingle Street. The water's just on the other side of the houses. Way out there? That little line of houses? Clearly, they were not impressed. The narrow road crossed the flat, moor-like pasture, turned to the right between the two-story white Coast Guard building, and ran behind the row of 6 modest cottages. It ended at the round Martello Tower, left over from the Napoleonic War. It had been 16 years since Bill and I had lived there. Now we were returning to see the place that was so vivid and so unique in our memories. And we were anxious to show our oldest son where he had lived the first 3 months of his life. We had been such kids ourselves then. Bill was a young second lieutenant in the Air Force, suddenly transferred from Germany to England, and I was pregnant with that first child. Being transferred here on such short notice, we'd had trouble finding a place to live. This house had been vacant because most of the Air Force people lived on base. And it seemed so far out. Besides, it had a few handicaps. At night, all the houses except ours glowed with a warm yellow light of gas fixtures. When electric wires were going to be extended to Shingle Street, the handful of families who lived there had said no. They do without electricity, thank you. They were only 80 miles from London, and they knew that with electricity would come development, more houses, fish and chip stands, and city people. Our house, curiously named the Mansion, had been recently remodeled by a retired British Army major and had its own source of electricity, 1,200 watts. So I could produce by a diesel generator in a little shed in the field behind. That's not a lot of power, so I could only iron during daylight hours. There wasn't enough power for electric lights, too. When we turned on a light switch in the house, we would hear the generator begin. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Our lamp began to glow, wavering brighter and brighter, until we no longer noticed the thumping of the generator, spoiling the quiet night. But once we were in bed, when we wanted to read a bit before going to sleep, or later in my pregnancy when I was timing contractions, it was easier to light a candle on the bedside table than get out of bed, cross the cold floor to flick the switch, and wait to hear the generator and our electric light waver on. Over the years, whenever I smelled the hot wax of a candle, I would be transported back to that cold bedroom and would feel again the blessed warmth of the hot water bottle between the cold, damp sheets, and hear again the low rumble of the shingle as the waves pushed it back and forth at the water's edge. We spent our evenings in chairs pulled up close to the living room fireplace, our only source of heat in the whole house. Behind us, the dark blue wallpapered walls looked shadowy in the firelight. Over its 100-year history, the house had been inundated by high tides so often enough to deposit salt in the plaster. When the humidity was high, and it usually was during the winter, the salt in the plaster acted as a desiccant, drawing moisture from the air and producing dark, damp spots on the wallpaper. Most of the residents of Shingle Street were politely cordial, but distant. We were, after all, outsiders, and they knew we were temporary. There were kindnesses, though. I remember one day shortly before Christmas when one of the village children, a girl of about 10, came to the door with a coaster wagon full of holly. "Mom thought you'd like this," was all she said. Our favorite people in Shingle Street, and the only ones we really got to know, were our next door neighbors, the Andrews. A carpenter by trade, Eric Andrews was also the Coast Guard man. So they had one of the 2 telephones in the village. The other was in a traditional red telephone booth set on the slight rise above the beach. The squawking of the seagulls protesting that I was in the territory sometimes made it hard to hear when I was calling my friends on base. Eric Andrews had a warmth and a dry sense of humor that made us glad to have him for our friend and neighbor. Mrs. Andrews was equally kind, and when she learned that all our household goods had been lost between Germany and England, and that I wanted to make maternity clothes, she offered the use of her portable sewing machine. I gladly accepted without thinking what would power a machine if there was no electricity, and would also allow the machine to be portable. I had to spin the wheel with my right hand while clumsily guiding the cloth with my left. A treadle machine is far more efficient, and my right arm became tired after sewing only 3 seams on a maternity skirt. I sewed the rest of my wardrobe on an electric sewing machine in the on-base apartment of a friend. The Andrews had both grown up on Shingle Street and had raised their own family there. If they disliked having Americans renting a house next to theirs, or resented the sound of the generator breaking the quiet of their evenings, they never let us know it. When our child was born, we named him Eric, partly in admiration for our neighbor. Our year at Shingle Street was like no other in our lives. When we look back on it, our memories were so clear and distinct, unique enough never to be confused with the year the Air Force sent us to West Texas, to Florida, or to Germany. And the Andrews also stood alone in our recollections, with no others like them. We parked our car next to the mansion, our Shingle Street house, and although it mostly looked like we remembered it, we could already see some differences. Electric wires were strung along the side of the road and were attached to the building. Where I had hung diapers on the clothesline in the field behind our house, amazingly, there was now a tennis court. Although we knocked, there was no one home. We peered through the windows, hardly recognizing the living room with someone else's furniture. In the dim light, we couldn't see if there were wet spots on the wall, or even if there was the same dark blue wallpaper. We wondered if the bedroom was still cold. Walking out onto the shingle to look back at the village, it was obvious that electricity had not brought fish and chip stands to the village, and there was only one new house blending in with the others, all facing out to the shingle beach. A child playing behind what had been the Andrews house told us that they now lived 3 doors down. As we walked there, we tried to tell our children about the English couple, so central to our memories of that magic year. They had seemed ageless then, and we did some quick mental arithmetic so that we would be prepared for their older appearance. The kids hung back a little as Bill and I stepped on the small porch. When Mrs. Andrews answered our knock, she smiled at us a little hesitantly. Bill explained, I'm Bill Weitkamp, and this is my wife, Audrey. We used to live next door to you in the mansion. I was a young Air Force officer then, and it was the year our son, this one, he said, motioning to our oldest, was born. We thought we'd come back to Shingle Street to show him where he was born. Come in, come in. She turned and called through the open door. Eric, come see who's here. They're the, what did you say your name was? Weitkamp, Bill repeated. The Weitkamps, they used to live next door to us before we moved to Mother's house. Do sit down. When did you say you lived here? In 1959. Oh, that's a long time ago. I'll bring some tea, she said brightly. Would you children like some biscuits? When she disappeared into the kitchen, Eric Andrews smiled at us with a warm, open smile that we remembered. He was a little stooped now, but otherwise not that much different. You look much the same, Eric, Bill said. The years haven't changed you much. Eric Andrews looked at Bill hard, obviously trying to think what this middle-aged, bearded American would have looked like as a 25-year-old so many years before. Oh, we've changed some. We moved into Mother's house after she died. You have electricity now, I ventured, hoping the recall of the bottled gas would jog his memory. Mrs. Andrews came back in with a tray. Here are some tea and biscuits. You say this one was born here? What's your name? Eric, our son said, looking slightly uncomfortable as the subject of such scrutiny. Well, chuckled Eric, well, chuckled Eric Andrews, you've changed a lot since you lived here. And what did you say your names are? Mrs. Andrews asked our other son and his younger sisters. We drank our tea and talked of the changes that had come to Shingle Street. Eric Andrews explained how the strict zoning had protected their tiny village, so that even the coming of electricity had not changed it too much. And it's easier now, of course, he said, with electric irons and toasters and lights that turn on with a switch. Were you the ones from Ohio? Asked Mrs. Andrews. No? Well, I get a little confused. There was an American family in that house every year that Colonel Miller, or Major Miller, rented it out. We finished our tea and biscuits and chatted a little more. You have to go? Well, it was so nice of you to stop in. The old couple smiled and waved goodbye to us from their front porch. Come back again, called Eric Andrews as we walked back down the beach. We drove along the flat road toward the trees and the highway. I looked back once and saw the little line of houses and knew that the shingle beach and the water were just behind them.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Oh, what a story. So well told. I think Cassandra and Audrey have inspired us to write until you get it right. Thank you so much,
You're
Audrey.
welcome.
Again, I was right with you.
Can I read one more very quickie?
Yes.
I would like to. This one I wrote just 2 days ago, but I have told it to friends several times, even though it happened a long time ago. It's called Conspicuous in Madura. When we were in our 50s, Bill and I made 2 month-long bicycle trips in Indonesia. The first had been to Java and Bali, and the second was to Madura, Bali again, and to Lombok. The incidents I'm describing were on the island of Madura. The Lonely Planet Guide to Indonesia claimed that Madurans were rather hostile to foreigners, but we didn't find that to be true. The island didn't get many foreigners. Not surprising if prospective tourists had read the same guidebook. And we did have to get used to being the center of attention. I remember once being at a bull race, a purely local event where Bill and I were the only foreigners. The bulls were small, the kind that usually pulled plows. Before the race began, we walked around the field where each bull was being massaged with beer and decorated with garlands of flowers before the race. It was an extraordinary scene. And while Bill was taking pictures, I wandered around admiring the beautiful little animals and soaking up the atmosphere. Although it was crowded, I never had to wonder where Bill was. I just had to scan the crowd. Most of the people in my immediate area were looking at me, and those who weren't were looking at Bill. Sometimes the attention became tiring. I remember the time we stopped to eat a snack in a small village. We were sitting on a curb, and Bill unwrapped a candy bar, thinking the calories would give us the boost that we needed to continue. First, one person stopped to watch, then another, until there were 8 to 10 people surrounding us, seemingly mesmerized by the sight of 2 foreigners sharing a candy bar. After a few minutes, the rapt attention became oppressive, and I suggested to Bill that we get back on our bikes and eat while we were riding. We must have been less tired when the play episode happened, because the whole thing was a lark. We were riding along a quiet country road when we were surprised to hear a dramatic voice declaiming, and followed by the sound of a gamelan, an Indonesian orchestra. Naturally, we stopped our bikes to investigate. "Come in," beckoned a man who had seen us peering through the bamboo. We quickly locked our bikes together and followed him. We were surprised to see that behind the bamboo was an open-sided community building filled with people watching a play. The gamelan musicians sat on the floor in front of the stage. The welcoming man escorted us to 2 empty seats near the front, smiled warmly, and left us. We had chanced upon a touring theater group from the National University, acting one of the popular stories from the Hindu Ramayana. It was as much a part of Indonesian culture as Bible stories are in ours. There had been a stir in the audience when we had been ushered in, and it didn't quiet down much after we were seated. The audience members were obviously excited by the sight of 2 white strangers suddenly in their midst. We tried to concentrate on the play and gamelan music interspersed with the dialogue spoken by the costumed actors, but it was difficult. I noticed a little brown hand, obviously belonging to the child behind us. He was reaching around Bill and gently fingering the reddish blonde hair on Bill's forearm. The child was just curious, probably because he'd never seen body hair that wasn't black. The actors tried gamely to continue, but it was impossible. The audience was familiar with the stories, but not with the 2 exotic people who had suddenly appeared from nowhere. The play limped to a halt, and the person who invited us in came to us with a polite request. Would we mind sitting on the stage? It was the only way they could keep the audience looking in that direction, and we agreed. 2 chairs were brought up on the stage, a little to the side, so as not to interfere with the action. Bill and I climbed up on the stage and sat in the chairs. After another burst of audience conversation, probably pertaining to our appearances, now that everyone could see us, the audience settled down and the play resumed. Bill and I were careful to watch the actors instead of looking out at the audience. Afterwards, we were warmly greeted by the original welcoming man and by several other people. But I don't remember any of the actors thanking us for our distracting appearance.
Oh, bravo, bravo. Thank you, Audrey. And let's all go home and write. Thank you for a rich hour.
You're
Very, very rich.